Good evening, everybody. Happy Wednesday. This is Direct Line Live. I am your host, Jackie Saxton, and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Mark Unkefer. And tonight we are joined by author REBEKAH KOFFLER. REBEKAH is the author of Putins Playbook, and Dwight can show you guys the cover real quick, and you can also see it behind REBEKAH everywhere. REBEKAH, how are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. So if everyone watching can't tell, tonight's topic is going to be predominantly surrounding Russia and socialism and all that fun stuff. So Mark, I'll let you lead off with the first question.
Well, sure. And I guess probably at the outset is kind of explained there's some misconceptions about when you talk about Putin, it's sort of a Rorschach test of the last election and everything else. What you focused on is Putin's effort or Russian efforts to destabilize Europe and the United States. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Of course, this is actually what the book is about. It's about Putin's goal to undermine and weaken America using the strategy that the Russian General Staff developed based on Putin's orders. And that plan and the strategy has 5 prongs: cyber, space, counter space, spies, traditional, espionage, something called active measures, which includes anything from election interference to intimidation and assassinations, and military option, including nuclear. So the strategy is intended to be able to use both kinetic and non-kinetic options.
Now, obviously, we haven't seen a nuclear option take place yet, but how many of those strategies have we seen or can we prove that have come into play so far?
Well, all of them are playing into play. It's just, we've experienced in one way or the other. All of them. It's just that the problem is the media is not reporting. The major focus is on cyber, and yes, indeed, Putin has been waging cyber warfare on our country, from attacking really anything, government agencies, including the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, businesses, including our critical infrastructure, such as our meat supply and our gasoline supply. That's what the media is reporting. However, also, let's say space and counter space. Putin has decided, Putin and his generals, quote unquote, that Russia's or America's rather vulnerability is dependence on space, on satellites for every aspect of our life, anything from GPS to conducting precision strikes, bomb guidance, navigation, missile warning, anything really. So he developed the capability to bypass our conventional superiority by targeting what they perceive as our vulnerability. And they really, use that capability. GPS jamming is very frequently used. And in terms of all the other, instruments, spies, we know that back in 2010, the Obama administration sent back 10 so-called, sleeper agents, right? Election interference, the Russians have interfered, in 2016, 2018, 2020. And these are only the things that media has reported, right? They routinely interfere in elections. They routinely infiltrate spies to, NATO, or the United States. In terms of nuclear, you mentioned nuclear. The Russians are very actively preparing for that. There are exercises routinely where Putin himself, participates in the simulation of nuclear strikes. And this is precisely why former President Trump authorized our military and the defense industry to develop low-yield nuclear weapons. That is because we need to counter Russian, what's called escalate to de-escalate strategy. So that's all that stuff is in detail in the book.
Can you elaborate a little bit about what their sort of near-term objectives? We've talked about the long-term objective is sort of to reverse what's happened to Russia with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Can you talk a little bit about what their objectives in all these initiatives is?
Right. So their own objective is really to build up Russia back into what they call the great power, or держава in Russian. And that requires both, military and diplomatic posture, very robust military capability. But they have concluded that regardless who is in charge in America, whether it's Democrats or whether it's Republicans, that the United States is an impediment to them, that we will not allow them to reconstitute their, what's called the Eurasian Union, right? Which is pretty much the Soviet Union, except it's called, the Union. They call it right now the Eurasian Union, and shorthand is the Union. They know that we won't allow Ukraine, Georgia, and other former Soviet states to be absorbed into that. And so that's why they decided that the best way to do that is to destabilize our society. And so that's why we see all that polarization. Since the 2016 elections, our society is just torn apart, and they're amplifying all of these divisions, along political lines, religious lines, ethnic lines. They do that by various, means, most importantly through social media.
Now, specifically with regard to the election interference, you mentioned that, they have interfered with our elections, not just in 2016, but 2020 as well. And, it's not a one-time thing. And yet the media seems to only be reporting, oh, well, they did interfere in the 2016 election and they were doing it to help Trump, and Trump was involved in it. So doesn't the fact that we can say definitively that they did interfere with the 2020 election kind of counteract the fact, considering that Trump is no longer the president?
So exactly, this is you nailed it. They focused on 2016, but also on the false narrative, which was originally the Russian disinformation that was fed through the Steele dossier, right? And then, unfortunately, our corrupt intelligence officials in the upper echelons of the intelligence community, such as Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, FBI Director James Comey, CIA former, or all of those are former, obviously, Director John Brennan, they propagated this Russian disinformation and the quote-unquote Trump-Russia collusion through the media, and it took off, and it's basically poisoned the relationship between the various groups within our own country. So these individuals despicably were doing Putin's bidding, dividing our country and destabilizing it, just like Putin envisioned, right? Well, that didn't happen. There was no collusion. It's science fiction, and Mueller himself proved it. And so, as you said, in 2018 and in 2020, they interfered also. But that interference is not intended to elect a specific president, because they have no ability to do that. And they know that, right? And they know that they can't do that. Therefore, none of the votes were really it was the interference in terms of manipulation. They like to manipulate the minds. But the voting machines themselves, they were not intruded upon, right? The votes were not manipulated by the Russians at all. So
and that's an important distinction, because I think a lot of people hear, election interference, they think, oh, they're hacking the machines, when really there are other types of election interference.
That's exactly right. And just to be clear, they do conduct cyber operations against the voting infrastructure, but it's not to change votes. It's more to sow doubt in the integrity of the election process, right? Because when people know that the Russians conducted some, what we call cyber attack, but the proper term is really cyber intrusion, they don't trust the outcome of the election, but they don't change the actual votes. They don't need to. That's just not their objective, and they want to do it sort of below the threshold of an aggressive response from the United States, which they've managed to achieve, because we haven't done anything in terms of response for the past 20 years, including like President Biden talks a very tough talk, calls Putin a killer, but in terms of actually responding to Russia's aggression, including in the cyber domain, nothing has been done.
Now you referenced the sort of involvement of the U.S. intelligence community kind of in circulating, recirculating, and spreading this. It might be a good time to kind of elaborate. You've worked in the past in that community, and indeed, whole sections of your book have been deleted, marked out, whatever. However,
yes.
That. Can you elaborate? I mean, how you were in the community, and I realize there's a limit to how much you say, but however much you can say, can you tell us a little bit about that and how you came to lead?
Of course. So there's a standard process, which is a mandatory process for each intelligence officer when we are out of the community. If you write a book, you're supposed to go through what is called pre-publication review, or the PRB. So when I submitted my manuscript, the government really tried to sabotage the publication of this book. Why? Because I was very outspoken about the government incompetence with regard to dealing with Putin and with Russia, and lack of proper resources in the community to deal effectively with this highly sophisticated intelligence target and a grave threat to America. I was very critical of that. So obviously, the government did not want Americans to know about its deficiencies that exist in the intelligence community. And so at first, the way that they tried to sabotage this book, first, they didn't respond to me for a very long time. And, I tried to contact them every possible way, to the point where the publisher had to delay the publication of the book. And then when they finally responded to me at the 11th hour, they claimed that there was classified information. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. There was no classified information. If there was classified information, I would be in the brig right now, like Colonel, Scheller, right? So the reason they did that, they thought, and some of the information was blatantly unclassified. For example, General Breedlove, who endorsed my book, and you see on the back of the book his blurb. He was he's the former EUCOM, European Command chief, a 4-star general, and also Supreme Allied Commander Europe, right? They deleted his quote, which was unclassified. It was already in the open source domain. And the general himself asked me, Rebecca, why did they delete this? Well, the reason I believe they blacked out a whole bunch of stuff that was unclassified is because they thought I would engage in a negotiation with them, right? So that the book would be even further delayed. So I took their redactions wholesale and I said, okay, fine, we're just going to print it as is. And my publisher agreed to do that. Well, DIA came back to me and said, well, don't you need, oh, and when I asked them to provide to me alternative language, which is what they were supposed to do, if they believe something is classified, they're supposed to give you an alternative language. And they said, no, it's not possible to give you alternative language. And then when I accepted everything wholesale, they said, well, don't you want to edit some of these sentences that are partial sentences? I said, no, how am I supposed to do that? You yourself said it was impossible. If it's impossible for you, how would I do that? And, but if I did any editing myself, I would have had to submit it yet again and again and again. And that's what sometimes happens. Some of the officers have to wait 5 years, to get their books cleared. Well, nobody's going to be interested in that book, and the publisher would have dropped the contract already. So these are the games that they play, against people who speak the truth, just like Colonel Scheller did in the Pentagon.
Yeah, and it's giving you the opportunity to, even in a foreword, to say, hey, this is what these are the sentences they didn't want you to see. You can see where there are blank spaces where the government is trying to essentially censor your voice, and in a way, because truly, I believe you when you say that nothing you wrote was classified is infringing upon your First Amendment rights to speak about what you know.
Absolutely. So I even wrote an op-ed about this in Town Hall. And the op-ed is called Top Secret Vietnamese Soup, How U.S. Government Tried to Censor My Book. And I will go ahead and I will disclose to you, because this is how ridiculous it is with some of the stuff that they deleted. I said that CIA's cafeteria was better than DIA's cafeteria, because I was doing, some work, also some special projects with the National Clandestine Service. I was a frequent visitor of CIA's cafeteria, which is, by the way, has delicious stuff. So they deleted that. The Vietnamese soup, okay? And I feel so confident in disclosing it here with you that they can't possibly, have no leg to stand on, with regard to this type of stuff and other things. But most of it was criticism that they don't have experts with language skills. They don't have the true Russia experts with cultural expertise. And it's not only Russia. Look at Afghanistan, right? After 20 years, we effectively surrendered, and we have the best military in the world, the best warfighting force in military history. And yet we were, quote unquote, defeated by people who use gadgets like IEDs. Why? It's because there's no expertise in the community that focuses on doctrine and strategy, that anticipates, that type of analysis would anticipate how your adversary would fight. What do they think? What do they bring to bear? And that just doesn't exist, not with regard to Russia. Afghanistan is a prime example. And of course, they don't want to hear from voices like Colonel Scheller,
Yeah, look, and I'll tell you, and it's horrifying. I was reading a Daily Caller article earlier today that said in a briefing that came out that there were 5 people on one of the civilian flights leaving Afghanistan who had every intent of hijacking the plane. Fortunately, they were thwarted, but, yet again, a failure in our intelligence community to really vet the people that they're putting on these planes.
It's frightening. And just to be clear, there are some excellent people, very good people in the community with whom I served. I was honored to serve, and they do the mission and they would sacrifice everything, to protect Americans. But it's a handful of people, and they're also misused. For example, in the run-up to the 2016 election, there were many people, like true Russia experts, who were forced out of the community. One of my bosses who speaks Russian and exactly the type of experts that I think the community needs. We did some really good work together. Well, he was reassigned to Latin America. How does that even make sense?
So you've talked a little bit about intelligence, and I have to say that some of the issues you raised in terms of cultural awareness and language skills, you've certainly had company in other books that have made the same point. So it's not as though it was exactly news to them. Could we come back to a little bit to talk about Russia? Well, first of all, let's talk about your own background. I think we were talking before that you came from the Soviet Union. Well, it was then the Soviet Union when you left. Talk a little bit about your background, about how you came to the United States.
Sure. I was born and raised behind the Iron Curtain in the totalitarian socialist state that no longer exists because it was destroyed by socialism. For whatever reason, my mother, who disagreed, both my parents, mom and dad, they disagreed with the Soviet socialist system. And they were raising us, me and my sister, to love America. And they wanted us to study and learn English so that eventually we would go to America. So I'm the oldest, and I didn't know why at the time, because ever since I was a child, I knew that one day I would go to America. I didn't know why, but I knew I needed to learn English, and I needed to be very good at that. And so eventually I went to university in Moscow. I studied English and French. And while I was a student, I also worked part-time as a tour guide and a Russian English interpreter and translator. And I met exchange students from Britain and from America. And I was stunned at how free they acted, and how basically they just had this amazing attitude that nothing was impossible. Like they really had this true, the American spirit. And they said, well, Rebecca, you need to come to America. What are you doing here? And I said, well, that's what my mom said, always told me. And so first I came, to visit, and then eventually I immigrated. And I just can't tell you how blessed I feel, to be an American. Like I'm just thrilled, and I pray every day. Both my sister and I. Eventually, I brought my sister, and I brought my dad. My mom died at 55 years old, courtesy of the wonderful free socialist medical care. But both my sister and I, and my dad, of course, we pray every day that we're here. And this is why I'm very concerned about, what's going on in terms of the trending, the developments in our society right now are very worrisome to me.
And we touched on it a little at the outset, but it probably needs expanding. As you've talked about what Putin's objective is, in effect, I mean, he was a KGB agent. He served in Germany and was very much, I guess, affected by the fall of the Soviet Union, and is very much motivated, I think, as you write, to try and, how shall I say, find some kind of restoration for Russia's role now, that would be comparable to the way the Soviet Union was. Now, how does that play in? Let's talk about what his attitudes are towards NATO and the strategies that he's used to try and counteract NATO, which has certainly been one of the bulwarks that we've had against the Soviet Union and now Russia.
Exactly. So one of his tactics is to divide NATO. Why? It's because they have concluded, having watched, our military operations for the past 20 years, they see that our strength is in our unity, right? And they also are concerned that the United States and NATO seek Russia's regime collapse, and specifically the elimination of Putin from power, because Putin was really, really shocked when with what happened with Saddam Hussein, with Muammar Gaddafi. Because he's oppressor, he also fears, something like that, an end like that. So therefore, he believes that if he divides NATO, that we can't, possibly achieve any kind of action against Russia. He believes that we want to chop off, Ukraine, Georgia, and all of these other former Soviet states away from the Russian orbit, right? And so, if you look right now at NATO, there's an old NATO, there's an old Europe and new Europe. So he's trying to divide, and you look like Germany is pretty much, very pro-Russian, if you will, and some of the others don't really care that much. And so it's very difficult to achieve some sort of unity. Like, for example, you see what's going on right now with Nord Stream and with Russia using gas, and its energy resources as a geopolitical weapon. So that's how he's using that kind of tactic.
There was a rumor that went around last year, and I'm just remembering this, and it hit the news for a little bit of time, that Putin was planning on stepping down. Was there, or because of his health, was there any truth to that, or was that part of a disinformation tactic, or what do you think that was about?
It's very unlikely that Putin will voluntarily step down, because Putin equates the security and stability of the Russian state with his leadership and his power. He views himself as the modern czar, if you will. And so it's really unlikely. And if you look at the Russian elections, pro-Putin party is very far ahead all other alternatives. And also another nuance that I will bring up here, because I was asked a lot this question back, in my intel business. What happens if Putin is not in power? Well, the second candidate is typically the runner-up, is always a communist in every single election. So Putin is really, believe it or not, is even not the worst case scenario. He can be worked with on a transactional basis, but certainly from the position of strength. He cannot be appeased. So the fact that President Biden, was begging him not to hack our networks, to the point where he was handing to him a roster of 16 critical infrastructure targets, is ridiculous. And the whole reset, it looks like Biden is, on the way pushing another reset. It's just not going to work. You have to deal with Putin from the position of strength.
Now, is there a fear of any kind of collaboration between Russia and China, with, in terms of attacking Europe or the US or anything in that regard?
So I believe that is overestimated, this type of collaboration. I strongly disagree with the intelligence community's latest assessment that China and Russia are strategic partners. Nothing can be further from the truth. It's a marriage of convenience. Russia views China as its security threat number 2, following, the quote unquote, the main enemy that the Russians have always called the United States, главный противник. So we're number 1, China is number 2, because obviously they see how powerful economically and militarily China is becoming. They're not, their military is not as robust as the Russian military for many reasons, but they still fear China because of its pace of growth and the long border with Russia. So the only thing to worry is, Russia and China potentially, timing some sort of action, anti-US hostile action, doing it in parallel, but they don't collaborate. They fear each other. All of those demonstrations, when they conduct joint military exercises, that is all for the show. That is their deception, their propaganda, specifically for us to buy, for people who are naive, who really don't understand the in depth that relationship. And but no, there's no collaboration, like at the fire control systems are not integrators, nothing like that, between Russia and China. They cannot wage a war against us collaboratively.
So the tension between them obviously predates China's
Exactly.
strength, and if anything, now Russia has more to fear from China than it did. I guess the last time they went to war, which I guess would have been in '69, they actually
Right on.
had a shooting war then.
Yep.
But let me talk back to Ukraine, and one of the fascinating thing, and we've kind of talked about in a number of different ways, is the style of engagement, this sort of asymmetric challenge where the Russians use strategies that don't quite come to the threshold of triggering a response, but are below that and kind of on multiple fronts, but in a way to kind of avoid that. Now, that raises a question at what point should there be a response? But we've certainly seen that in the Ukraine. And we talked before, I must say, I love the phrase, the little green men, although I guess you call that active. The better term is active measures of using sort of deniable responses as a way, or deniable aggressions as a way of avoiding getting a response back. Could you elaborate a little bit, because that seems to be a common thread to some of the strategies that Putin has been trying?
Exactly. There's a whole, chapter that I dedicate to the in the book. The strategy, as you correctly pointed out, is called asymmetric strategy. Colloquially, the actual term is strategy of indirect action that the Russians actually borrowed from Western doctrine. Sir Liddell Hart, was the thought leader behind that. And the Russians study very intensely, Sun Tzu, Western strategist, and then, they study our society and how, basically what our hot buttons are and the way that we conduct warfare. And then they work out their own approach, right? So the strategy of indirect action, another term is used, controlled instability. The thought leader behind that is General Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of Russian General Staff. And basically, it's use of special forces, like you said, the Green Man, Russia's Spetsnaz, and timing it with cyber operations, both disinformation and cyber attacks. And it's done, in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine was very quickly invaded in a matter of like hours, if you will. And then subsequently, part of Ukraine was occupied by Russia, and eventually Crimea was annexed by the Russians. The way that they do that was, in the beginning, they conducted military exercises, and they were building the military force up and down, sort of moving it in and out to desensitize the Western intelligence services so that they can do what's called a strategic surprise, or in that case, it was a tactical surprise. The strategic surprise was the annexation of Crimea. Nobody saw that coming, really. And so that was done very quickly. Another reason why the strategy is used is because they know that we only will respond militarily if something kinetic, happens. But they do it clandestinely. And so we can't respond. There was a paper written by U.S. Army, Outplayed in the Gray Zone, because this type of strategy, the blue, blue doctrine, friendly doctrine, is calling it gray zone. And so the U.S. Army felt like we were really outplayed by the red in that particular area. And so that is why I'm a very strong proponent of getting expertise in our national security apparatus in doctrine strategy, not chase the bright and shiny objects, I call it also oop-to-do intelligence, which is right. It's like, but doctrine and strategy is not something that you can count, right? Because we're big on like counting the capability. We know, oh boy, how many tanks, how many bombs, how many this or that, but things that are not countable, such as the mindset of our adversary, right? Such as the culture, such as their doctrine and strategy. Those things are consistently underestimated, and we just don't have the right expertise, and we need to build that up.
But even when we understand that, there presents obviously a huge challenge in terms of figuring out when you're going to tick off a political response, and that may be a good, or what the political response should be. They're kind of dealing with that inability to do for the Americans or the West to be able to do that. But that may raise a question about the Baltics. It's sort of fascinating, I guess, maybe just to me. But so we've talked about the Ukraine, obviously the Crimean, but that there, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe there have been anywhere near these level of incursions in the Baltics, which are part of NATO. Is it because they're NATO? Is it because, clearly Putin would love to return the Baltics to his sphere of influence.
Right, definitely, because the Baltics are part of NATO. They're treated differently than, let's say, Ukraine and Georgia. And this is why Putin is waging this conflict, the covert war in Ukraine is to destabilize that country so that we don't accept them to NATO. Because one of the requirements for NATO membership is territorial integrity, right? So definitely he would think twice before doing something in the Baltics. That is not to say that a covert, war is waged there as well in terms of like cyber operations and other types of, sabotage. For example, one of the things that Putin has done is he passed a law that Russia has the right to interfere militarily in the country, in any country, when the Russian population is, oppressed, for the lack of the better word, right? And a bunch of these, Baltic countries have some Russian population in them that could be used to foment social unrest. Unfortunately, because some of those Baltic states, pretty much most of them, they are concerned about such things, and they don't allow or rather, they don't have, let's say, Russian TV channels, for those people. And because those Russians, ethnic Russians, don't speak local languages, they are displeased with that situation. They believe themselves to be somewhat, some of them, right? So it provides fertile ground for Putin to stage something like that. And that's a big concern. But yes, he would be thinking twice, before doing it against the Baltics. But again, we need somebody who is a strong leader, both, in America, the US president, and in charge of NATO as well.
And obviously the support of our NATO countries. We'll see what happens in Germany and others as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the reaction that you've had from the book? We started at the beginning, and comment about how has it been received elsewhere?
From how do you mean, like in elsewhere?
Like the general public, have they been receptive, buying it?
Oh,
a lot of rude comments on the internet.
Okay, I see. So people who have read the book love it. I have most of my ratings on Amazon are 5 stars or close to 5 stars, right? This being said, the book is currently not the bestseller. My publisher is saying it will likely be a steady seller than a bestseller. Why? It's because the book does not fit in a specific narrative, because we're so divided. When people hear Russia, one side immediately equates it with the quote unquote collusion that didn't exist, right? And they want to hear something anti-Trump, and the book is not that. And the other side sometimes, or at least in the beginning, I was getting like cold responses when I was shopping my proposal, because the Republican side did not really want to talk about the Russian threat, because they were concerned about conflating it with the legitimacy of President Trump. Now I have good response. Now people understand, on the Republican side, understand that the book is about the Russian threat. It's not. So that's kind of the conundrum. But yes, people who actually understand the issue and what the book is about really are pleased with that, and I do have good reception.
Well, that's actually, I get, being a steady seller is actually for a book a good prospect. It's nice to get those checks in the mail on a regular basis. And I think, as you described, Putin is going to be around for quite some time. I was very interested in what you had to say about the demise of other strongmen like him. There's really not a very good retirement plan for them. They don't get to have presidential libraries and go out and give speeches and things like that. The outlook for them is not very good when they leave power. So
I don't think Saddam Hussein's doing much of anything these days.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's interesting, but it is also a challenge that we'll be facing. We talked about, obviously, the Ukraine, but we've also talked about the prospect in the Baltics, and clearly that's a red line that we in the West, both the United States and Europe, need to be very protective of.
So true. Yes. Yeah. I'll take a steady seller any day. It's really also intended to be a sort of Russia 101, and I'm hoping they will use it in the intelligence community to train young intel officers. And I'm already getting feedback, from some of my sources that they are using it, and they're very pleased, which I'm very pleased. I've done my duty to serve, and then now I've done my duty to help uphold U.S. security by writing this book.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you. And obviously that is another thing to accomplish with the book, is to be able to influence policy and policymakers with your ideas. And so that's very encouraging to hear. I'll kind of, if you have any last comments, we'll give you sort of the last word.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to talk about my book and to talk about socialism. So thank you for what you do, and I'm here anytime you need me.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. We didn't get a chance to go too far into seeing those parallels of socialism here, so I'll have to have you back to come on and talk about that in the near future. But thank you for joining us. Mark, thanks for co-hosting with me as always. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We will be back next Wednesday with another guest. Have a great night.
Thank you.